Okay, hello. So we're continuing with religious language, and today we're going to have a look at analogy. So what I would like you to do, just to begin with, is try and type a few ideas. Imagine that there is a blind African person. Try and describe what being in a snow blizzard would be like to them, please. Have a go, just a couple of minutes, just a few sentences. Try and work that one out for yourselves. Okay, so you probably, I imagine, found that a bit more difficult than what you would have perhaps first thought of. And I imagine that you used analogies to be able to explain to this blind African person what being in a snow blizzard would be like, because obviously they have no understanding or experiences of what being in a cold climate or what being in a blizzard would be like. And this is kind of the point of religious language and kind of the point of analogies when having a look at religious language, which is what we're going to have a look at in more depth today. So, the definition of an analogy is something which describes something which is unfamiliar to us, i.e. God, by making a comparison with something that we already know or understand. So William Paley does this, for example, in the teleological argument, when he explains the complexities of the world, which are unfamiliar to us to some extent, because we can't comprehend all of the world and all of its complexities at one time, but we can comprehend the complexities of a watch. So William Paley uses an analogy to be able to help explain something which we are unfamiliar with. But some other examples of analogies are things like her face was like thunder and as light as a feather. We're using something which we can understand to be able to attribute it to something that we perhaps won't be able to understand or won't be able to experience. So this is the point of using analogy in religious language. And again, this approach to religious language, just like Via Negativa, is an approach which tries to make religious language meaningful rather than deeming it meaningless, like the verification principles and the falsification principles. The main scholar that's associated with analogy in religious language is Aquinas. Now, we've seen Aquinas over and over and over again throughout this course. So, if I just refer you to the next slide, this is what I would start doing for all the scholars that we've come up with, especially now the fact that we've got loads of time, because you're not really in school, and you shouldn't really be leaving the house due to this kind of self-isolation lockdown that the country is currently in. So really you should be having loads of time dedicating it to your work. But before I show you my advice for what I would do for each scholar that we come across, particularly the ones that we come across regularly, like Aquinas and Hume, for example, I want to show you this quote, which is really, really poignant to analogy in religious language from Aquinas. So he says, "It seems that no word can be used literally to describe God." Now, this is a really poignant quote because he's basically saying that if we use human language and we try and attribute it literally to God, then we are always going to fall into the trap of anthropomorphism, because we've only ever got a limited human understanding. So by using analogies and different types of analogies, which we'll go through in a moment, Aquinas thinks that we can get rid of the problems of anthropomorphizing God. Now, I'm just going to kind of digress slightly on the next slide to show you a really good revision idea or a really good tip to get you thinking about all the different scholars which we cover across the course, because there are many, and to get you thinking about something called the dialogue section, which we'll touch on in year 13, and it's part of the exam spec if you want to have a little read of it anyway, where you have to link all of the ideas between Christianity, ethics and philosophy together. So this is a really, really useful way. My year 13s that have just left found this incredibly useful, and if you do it as we go along, it will be much easier for you to work through and work out. So I've slightly digressed off of the topic of analogy here, but as you can see, these are like revision clocks. So I'm assuming that you're all familiar with these types of revision clocks. Now in the middle, you would have any different scholar. So for instance here, I've put in Aquinas, but you could have Hume, you could have Paley, you could have Fletcher or Flew or whoever we've had a look at really. And then in each section of the clock, I have put part of the specification or part of the content which they link to. So we already know that Aquinas links to religious language and analogy. So in that section of the revision clock, I would type in all the notes about how Aquinas links to religious language and analogy. Then we know that he links to the cosmological argument in some way, because he's got 5 ways, and we know that his third way links to the cosmological argument. We also know that he heavily links into natural moral law, so I would link in this section here all of the ways which Aquinas links to natural moral law. We haven't yet covered conscience, but we will do, and he links to conscience, and he also links to the design argument. So you might also be able to find other elements or other areas of the specification where Aquinas is linked to. Now, by doing one of these and creating one of these, you have a snapshot of that philosopher and all the different elements that he branches into, which is really, really important for later on in the course. I would definitely start getting your head around doing some of this. Now, moving back to analogy. Like I said, that really, really good quote from Thomas Aquinas in Summa Theologica is, it seems that no word can be used literally to describe God. And he says it's really difficult to be able to use humanistic language, so the language which we use and understand, to try and be able to link it to a concept which we have no real experience and no real knowledge of. Now, he says that our humanistic language is either equivocal or univocal, and we'll come on to that in a second. But because our language is equivocal and univocal, it is always going to fall in the trap of anthropomorphizing God. So what is equivocal and univocal language? Univocal language is words with one meaning or one understanding. So if you take this word univocal and split it into 2, so uni meaning one, okay, so one unit, and vocal meaning vocabulary. So univocal means one vocabulary, one word. Okay, so examples of univocal language would be things like love, because love has one meaning. It doesn't have multiple meanings. Okay, now Hume weighs into this argument here, and Hume says words such as wisdom, thought, design and knowledge are all univocal because they are all words with one meaning. They're all words with one definition, particularly when we use these words to describe God. However, because we're using univocal language which we understand as humans, then it's limiting God. We're limiting how good or well designed or how knowledgeable God actually is. So we're falling into this trap that all religious arguments seem to be falling into at this moment in time. Equivocal language is when you've got one word which has 2 different meanings. Okay, so equivocal, again, if you split it up, equi is a bit like the word equal, and vocal again meaning vocabulary. So it's one vocabulary which has equal meanings or separate meanings depending on the different scenario in which you use it. So for example, you've got fruit punch and hole punch. They're different because a fruit punch is a drink and a hole punch is a object. Okay, so the word punch there means 2 different things. Then you've got produce, as in to produce something, and fresh farm produce in terms of a product. Then you have tear and tear. They're exactly the same word, like reading and reading, exactly the same word, but they have totally different meanings. Now, again, this is problematic when we talk about God, because how do we know what type of meaning we should be attributing to God? So, some strengths here. By using equivocal language, we can avoid problems of anthropomorphism, because we can say that the word good has two different meanings. So we can say it has a humanistic meaning, i.e. the book was good, but then it also has a God level meaning. So we can say that this word good has an equivocal meaning depending on who we are attributing it to. However, a weakness of equivocal language in religious language is that it makes God seem really different. It makes him really removed. And the further you remove God from humanity, the less personable he is. Now, in Christianity, God is a really personable figure. So by using equivocal language, we are distancing him from humanity, which is a problem when we have a look at things like prayer, because prayer is meant to be this personal connection, this personal dialogue with God. And if we are using equivocal language, which removes him ever so much more from humanity, there is a less personable connection with him, which is problematic. So Aquinas had a look at this and said actually there are problems with univocal and equivocal language when we try to talk about God in a meaningful way. Now, we know that Aquinas is a theologian. We know that he is a Christian because he's Saint Thomas Aquinas. So again, we know that he is looking for ways to make religious language meaningful. And analogies are really successful in making religious language meaningful. And he offers this middle way. So analogy is a middle way between univocal and equivocal language. Okay, it's not univocal because analogies don't have just one meaning. And neither is it equivocal because analogies don't remove God. They don't make God further away from humanity. So Aquinas comes up with two different types of analogy. So you've got analogy of attribution. And now the word attribution comes from the word attribute. Now, attribute is a bit like a reflection. If you attribute something, it's like a reflection or a part of that thing that you're talking about. Okay, so analogy of attribution is where we are reflecting qualities of God onto humanity. Now, you've got on Show My Homework a crib sheet, so I'm not going to explain it because I've spent ages typing it up for you to help you read it. But on the crib sheet, there's an example of the analogy of attribution from Brian Davis. Now, we heard from Brian Davis yesterday because he weighed in to the Via Negativa, talking about how, if we say God is not a wombat, we still don't actually know what he is. Okay, so Brian Davis comes up again in analogy, but Brian Davis seems to support religious language being meaningful if we speak of it in such of a way as analogies rather than the Via Negativa. So on the crib sheet, there's a bold section which says analogy of attribution and analogy of proportion, which we'll have a look in a minute. But Aquinas also weighs in and comes up with an idea of analogy of attribution. And he uses, rather bizarrely actually, he uses the idea of a bull's urine to attribute the health of a bull. So he says if we can check, if we have a pot of bull's urine and I don't have to see the bull, I could never have seen this bull in my entire life. But if I've got a pot of his urine for some really strange reason, and I test the urine to see if it's healthy, i.e. doesn't have any diseases or infections, then I can infer and I can attribute that the bull is healthy. Okay, so I can reflect, I'm reflecting here the quality of the bull's urine to the quality of the health of the bull. Now, as much as that's a really bizarre way of looking at things, he then turns this into God. And he says that if we can see that the world around us is, I don't know, really well designed, then we can infer and we can attribute a really powerful designer. So we're using an analogy here to be able to reflect the qualities of God down onto humanity, down into this earth. So if God is this transcendent, ultimate, perfect being, everything which we know and understand are attributes of God. They are reflections of God. Okay, so they're parts of God which we can understand as humans, but they're not the full quality of God. Again, look at the crib sheet, it will make a bit more sense. Then you have analogy of proportion. Now the word proportion means proportionate value. So like depending on how much something is, that's how much of a proportion you have. Now, I really like this way of having a look at analogy because I think it makes a lot of sense. So again, there's a bit more information on the crib sheet here for you. But say if I take the word good, now this word can have different proportionate values depending on who I'm attributing it to. So if I say Max, my dog, is good, then there's a certain proportion of goodness that a dog can achieve. Now, if I say my Year 12 philosophy and ethics students are good because they're doing all their work and watching the videos, then you have got a slightly higher proportionate level of good because you are more able and more capable than a dog. And then if I say that God is good, God has a higher proportionate value of goodness than us as human beings. So it's about using language in a proportionate value depending on who we are attributing or depending on who we are talking about. Okay, so the analogy of proportion is having proportionate values for univocal words depending on who we are speaking about. Again, Hick weighs in here and he uses an example from a man called Hugel about the ideas of faithfulness. And again, this is explained in bold on the crib sheet, so I would refer back to this. But Hick says that faithfulness of a dog is limited into the faithfulness of a human. So again, I've just kind of given you this example, but the faithfulness of a dog is different to the faithfulness of a human, and the faithfulness of a human is different to the faithfulness of God. So faithfulness is proportionate depending on who or what we are applying it to. So Aquinas then goes on to further develop his ideas of analogy and says that we are using analogies of either proportionate value or attributional value when we have a look at God and when we talk about God in so many different ways that we haven't perhaps thought about. So some analogies that we are using to describe God are things like God is the Father. Now we all understand what a father is like. A father is there to punish you if you do something wrong, but to take care of you and to protect you. Okay, so by using the analogy of father to describe God, we can then infer that God is a protector, he's caring, he's loving, but he's also just and fair and kind, and will punish you if you need to be punished. He will teach you a lesson if you need that lesson to be punished, which again kind of answers some of the questions of the problem of evil. Now, judge, we say that God is the ultimate judge. Again, we have a knowledge of what a judge is. A judge is there to be fair, impartial, is there to kind of give verdicts on something and perhaps hand out punishments or rewards or whatever. Again, so if we attribute that to God, we know that he is also those types of qualities. Shepherd, because a shepherd is somebody who leads sheep. Now, we've had a look at this, and I know that we had a look at this at GCSE level as well. Jesus is often referred to as a shepherd of men because it's an analogy. So us as human beings are the sheep. We are the followers of Christianity. And then Jesus and God are the leaders. So they're the shepherds of men, the shepherds of Christianity. And then king. A king is this figurehead. A king is powerful. So again, we are using these types of analogies to describe what God is like. So, a bit of a task for you. What I would like you to do is to come up with your own example for analogy of attribution and apply it to God. Now remember, an attribution is a bit like a reflection. It's something which we can understand. So analogy of attribution, think of the ideas of Aquinas and the ideas of bull's urine. I don't have to see the bull, but if I've got something of him that I can test, I will be able to attribute that that bull is healthy. And then come up with your own idea of analogy of proportion and apply that to God, please, and show how that word has proportionate value depending on how you are, or depending on what you are linking it to. So again, I'll give you my example. You've got good, so the goodness of a dog is proportionate to the idea of a dog. But that's less proportionate to the goodness of you guys as students, and it's less proportionate to God. And then, once you've completed that, can you please complete this table below? So on the left-hand side, I've got lots of different phrases or lots of different types of analogies which are applied to God. So you've got a shepherd, a rock, good, love, and a personal being. They're all different types of analogies. In the central column, what I want you to do is try and figure out if it's analogy of attribution or analogy of proportion, and tell me why that type of analogy is valid. And then in the right hand side column, why should this analogy not be literal? Why is it actually an analogy? Why, for example, for a rock, why should I not think that God is actually a stone? Like, why is it an analogy? And what does the analogy mean? What's it trying to infer? So if I say God is a rock, what am I trying to infer from that analogy? Well, I'm trying to infer that God is stable. He's kind of reliable. He's strong. Okay, so that's what I want you to do. I would say that should probably take you no more than about 15 minutes. And if you can send me either a photograph, please, or a web page document of this, I'd be really, really grateful. Okay, nearing the end of this now. So you've got a man called Ian Ramsay, who's an English philosopher, again a modern day philosopher, so 1925 to 1972. What's really important for you to know is that Ian Ramsay is not specifically mentioned in the specification, but his views are really, really important for AO1 and showing the examiner and showing me when I come to set you an assessment, and a little mini mock, heads up there by the way, a little mini mock is coming your way in a couple of weeks, that you have a larger depth of understanding. And he adds to the ideas of religious language and analogy by adding two different terms. So he adds the word model and qualifier to the religious language and analogy debate. Again, more information on the next slide. So Ramsay said that analogy is really, really good, but we have to add to it. Aquinas' version of analogy is strong, but it's not as strong as it perhaps could be. So Ramsay said that we have two other types of words. We have model words, and model words are things which have a straightforward meaning, which are applied to ordinary things. So for example, the word creator is a model word for describing God. So God is a creator. Okay, but we can't just use model words on their own, because Miss Perry can be a creator. I don't know, Boris Johnson can be a creator. He's a creator of government, a creator of politics, and creator of kind of laws and all that kind of stuff. So a model word is successful, but they can't be used on their own. So Ramsey's saying that if we're using model words and using words which are some form of analogy, we have to be able to qualify those words. So here's a really good example, is that the word creator is the model word, but the word infinite and perfect are the qualifiers. So anybody can be a creator. That's why it's a model word, because it's an ordinary thing. But the qualifier words are infinite and perfect. These are the qualifiers to show us what we are actually talking about. Okay, so you have to qualify the model word. So you are, in other words, qualifying the ordinary word to be at a different level. Okay, so if you were to say something along the lines of an infinite creator, then we already know that that word or that sentence is talking about God. Now, I'm not going to read through this, but you may notice here that analogy, rather than any of the other examples that we've had a look at, so via negativa, falsification, strong verification and weak verification, analogy by far at this moment in time has got many more strengths than weaknesses. All of the other examples tend to have more weaknesses than strengths. So analogy actually seems to be a really, really positive way of approaching religious language and assessing whether or not it's meaningful. Okay, the biggest strength here is that it avoids anthropomorphizing him, because if we're saying that any God talk is an analogy, then we are automatically saying that we don't mean it to be a literal kind of conversation about God. So that's one of the biggest strengths. And then finally, you can plan this and you can write it if you've got time, but I definitely want to see a plan from everybody, please. So again, you can email me your plans or send me a photo of your plan, and I would like you to use the Intro Trade C structure. Analogy is not much use when it comes to describing something no one has seen. To be able to do this successfully, it would be really useful if you can add in other forms of religious language. So compare analogy to how successful verificationism is, or compare analogy to how successful via negativa is. Okay, and then that is that. Hopefully you're understanding this, and let me know and email me if you have any questions. Keep going, you're doing really, really well.